and a lot of people, me included, we don't know how to cope with grief. We many times don't know how to cope with our grief, and we also don't know how to cope with somebody else's grief. And many times, more often than we like, we are called upon that, right? To console a friend, to comfort a friend, a family member. And most people, they really don't know how to deal with it. So tonight we're going to look into grief and we're going to try to look at it from a different perspective. And there is a reason why I chose this topic tonight. Earlier this year, I myself went through an experience with grief. And I was very surprised at how I reacted to it. So, in the beginning of March, I got a call from a friend of mine. She was really frantic on the phone. And I couldn't really understand what was going on, so all of a sudden it sunk what she was telling me. She was telling me that one of her good friends had been in an accident, 3 of them, and she hadn't made it. And the other 2 were in the hospital. And as she's telling me this, I was finding it very hard to believe. Right? I wasn't quite comprehending what she was saying. And then all of a sudden, it sunk in what she was telling me. My good friend, somebody that was dear to myself, that had been with me through many experiences. She had disincarnated. She had died. She had left this world. And that hit me in a way that I didn't really quite expect. Right? It really hurt me. And I was very sad. I was crying a lot. Sometimes I would lock myself in a room in the house just so I could cry away from everybody. I didn't really want anybody to see me crying. I didn't want my husband to see me crying, right? But at the same time, I'm thinking to myself, well, if these people see me crying, they're going to look at me and they're going to say, well, but aren't you a spiritist? Don't you believe that the soul is immortal? Aren't you supposed to be good about grieving, about talking to people about grief? Why are you feeling this way? Well, nobody was actually telling me any of this. I was judging myself, right? I was telling myself this. And I was asking myself, well, you're supposed to know better. You know better. Why are you acting the way you are? So I had never really gone through an experience like that. I'm somewhat new to Spiritism, right? I attended my first meeting here in 2016. And I had never lost anybody that was close to me, that I loved dearly, right? So I had never really experienced grief after I became a spiritist. So truly, I had no idea how I was going to react. I assumed it was going to be easier. I assumed it was going to be okay because I have all this knowledge now, right? And more often than we would like, we hear a lot of people, there are spiritists there that study, right, spiritism, say that, well, you shouldn't behave in a certain way when you're grieving somebody, right? You shouldn't cry too much. And you hear that more regularly than what you would like. But what I came to understand is that they themselves don't really have an understanding, a true understanding of what it really means to grieve, right? And I was part of that because on a daily basis, I listen to lectures on YouTube from all kinds of places, from all kinds of people. Well, many times, the person speaking doesn't really understand what they're talking about. And we come with these misconceptions, or people who are not really part of Spiritism have those assumptions, and you hear that very often. And I thought that, hey, it's gonna be easy. But when I saw myself immersed in that, I just couldn't understand why it was happening that way. Well, I was in the middle of grieving. So now we are in the beginning of April. I get a call from my sister. She's crying on the phone. Can't really understand what she's saying. Then all of a sudden she goes, Dad is having a stroke. My father's in Brazil. So she's like, it's a massive stroke, and I couldn't really understand what she was saying. I was already numb from what I was going through. Now I was overtaken by fear. I said, well, my father is gonna die. If my father dies now, right? I'm not gonna be able to see him. I'm not gonna be able to have another conversation with him. And I was overtaken by that wave of sorrow and despair. So I didn't really know what to do. I booked a ticket and I flew down to Brazil. Well, I got to Brazil in the height of the pandemic. So they didn't have vaccines, right? It was something that I wasn't really expecting. You hear stories, but to live through it, it's something very different. The entire country was like a ghost town. There was nobody anywhere. There were days that my mom would lose 2 friends on the same day, right? My niece lost her father, her grandmother, and her uncle within 2 weeks. So it was an entire country grieving. And there I was, right in the middle of all of that, dealing with my personal grief as well. Well, I was there to console my mother, to comfort my family. And I didn't understand how I was going to be able to do that. So I was like, well, maybe I have to shut it all down and be strong for them. Because in my head, if I don't do that, I'm weak, right? Because my job is to be consoling them. My job is to be comforting them because I understand this better. I know that the soul lives forever. I know that nobody really dies, right? So I can comfort them. But I didn't really know how to do it because I was still dealing with not coping with grief myself. But something interesting happened. My parents are not spiritists. Right? I'm the only one in my family that is my spiritist. But I was spending a lot of time with them because my father demanded a lot of care. So I had the opportunity to be with my mom and my dad for a long time, something that I hadn't done in decades. And I was decided that I wanted to understand better what it meant to grieve according to Spiritism. I wanted to be able to feel comforted and consoled, but also to help others. So I decided that I was gonna study the Spirit's book with my parents. So I started to play the Spirit's book. We would listen to it, and I would explain to them in a way that I knew and in a way that they would understand. And what was interesting is that they were fascinated by it, right? So not only we studied the Spirit's book, we also listened to a lot of lectures given by Divaldo Franco, which is one of the biggest mediums in Brazil, has written hundreds of books on Spiritism. And as we listened to the Spirit's book and listened to this lecture, I started to understand better what it all meant, right? Things started to make sense to me. And a lot of the questions that I had, I started to having the answers for them. So that time that I spent in Brazil with my parents, that was a blessing, right? Not only I got to spend time that I hadn't spent before with my parents, we got to study Spiritism together, which is something that I love. So in all of that pain, there was a lot of blessings too. And I had to be able to see that, right? But I had a lot of questions, many questions, as it all is happening, right? So that is my friend. And the questions that I had were something like, why does grief hurt so much? Would you agree that it's hurtful, it's painful, right? Does everyone grieve, right? What about spirits? What do you think? Do spirits grieve? Is there a right and wrong way to grieve? Now, what should I say to a grieving person? And what about spiritism, right? What does spiritism do for those who grieve? And to my surprise, I got the answer to many of these questions. And we're going to talk about those. But before we get to that, I want to go through a little refresher on some concepts of spiritism. And I want you guys to help me out, okay? So I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to give me some answers. So a quick pop quiz. So the first question, what are some key concepts of spiritism? There are many, hundreds. I'm going to focus on two especially. But can somebody give me some of them? What does spiritism teach us?
The second question as one of the key concepts.
Reincarnation is a concept. What else?
Self-knowledge.
Knowledge, self-knowledge. So knowing yourself. Love. One of the biggest ones is love, right?
Also, mortality of the soul.
Immortality of the soul, right? So the two that I'm looking for, immortality of the soul and reincarnation. Now, why is reincarnation so important? Because it explains all the pains that we go through. What else? We learn. God's justice, one of the biggest ones, right?
As we're supposed to progress, it's our chance to progress.
Very good. Excellent. Now, this is just a brief summary of what it all means, okay? Because any of these topics, we could have an entire bachelor's course on them and we would still have stuff to study, right? So why is reincarnation so important? It is through reincarnation that we learn and evolve. What kind of world is Earth? Almost. We're getting there. Atonement, so it is a world of trials and tribulations, trials and expiation, right? Now, according to Spiritism, what is the threefolded nature of man, of the human being? What are we made of? Matter, body. What is it? Spirit. God. Above them all, there is God, right? So there are two elements in the universe, material, spiritual, above them all, God. But what about man? So we got body and we got soul. I'm looking for one more. Perispirit, right? Which links the body to the soul. So body, perispirit, and soul. I want you guys to think about this because these concepts will help us understand grief, right? And the process behind it and the reasons behind it. Now, we just talked about some of this. Do we really die? No. Do we really die? No.
What is the concept of dying? Depends on the concept of dying.
What's the concept of dying? Good question.
The body will die.
The body will die.
That's why we discarnate. We just leave the body.
There we go. So everybody's right? We don't really die, but we do die. Kind of confusing, right? But we have to understand this a little bit better. So if we go back here, what is the threefolded nature of man? Body, perispirit, and soul. So when we think about the soul, I am immortal, right? From the time of my creation, from the time that I was a spiritual principle, I will never cease to exist. I will live forever. I am immortal. But the body dies, right? So the person I am today, Rudy the Souza, will die, right? The who I am will die. The material form of me will die. The what I am lives forever, right? The spirit I am lives forever. But the who I am, that has an end, right? And it's very important to understand the difference between the death of the body and the immortality of the soul to better comprehend grief. When we grieve, we are not grieving the spirit. When we grieve, we are grieving the body, right? So Rudy the Souza has a story. This life that I lived now, that I'm living now, I have people surrounding me, people that I love, people who love me, memories that we shared, right? And this will come to an end. When this body dies, that's the end of that story. That's the end of that life. So the who I am now will come to an end. But the memories that I made, the teachings that I learned, that will all join with the teachings and lessons of lives past, right? And all of that make the what I am, which is spirit. But I will never again live the same life. So Rudy de Souza, after this life, he will never again exist in the way that he existed now. My experiences will be different, right? The people surrounding me will be different. So when we are grieving, we're grieving something real, right? It is a reality. So death is real. Grief is real. So when you're feeling that pain, when you're overtaken by sorrow, that happens because you're really saying goodbye to the person that you loved. Right? It is an end to a story. So when you are grieving someone, that person had a special place in your heart. When that person dies, that place is empty in a way, right? So all the love that you used to direct to that person, you can't physically direct to them anymore. All the memories that you made, you cannot make them anymore. You can't laugh together, you can't cry together, and you can't console each other together. So that leaves an emptiness. And that is one of the biggest parts of grieving. So yes, although we have the understanding that life is eternal, that the soul lives forever, the body dies. And that's what we are grieving. We're grieving the person. We're grieving that relationship that we had. So why does grief hurt so much? Because before there was grief, there was love, right? The only reason why we hurt and we are overtaken by pain and sorrow is because we loved. So in a way, grief is a byproduct of love, right? So I love, therefore I grieve. Now, this pain that we are feeling, all right, the pain that comes from grief, is it something that you can just shut away? You can't, right? You have to be able to deal with it. You can't just decide that I'm not going to grieve, I'm not going to suffer, I'm just going to push it away. It doesn't work like that. And nobody grieves the same way. Do you agree with that? right? The way that I grieve is different from the way that you grieve or everybody else. So there are certain similarities, but the time that I'm going to spend grieving, how I'm going to grieve, how much I'm going to feel, that is all different for everybody, right? It's not the same for me. It's not the same for you or for anybody else. But if we're able to understand that, we're better capable of helping ourselves and also helping others. So does everyone grieve? What do you guys think? Does everyone grieve?
In its own way, yeah.
In a way?
In its own way, because everybody grieves differently. There's people that can look at that and say, he's not grieving. He is, in his face.
Exactly. And it's interesting because grief sometimes get confused with mourning, right? So people don't know how to differentiate between grief and mourning. So the best way to separate them is grief is something that has to do with your feeling, how you feel, like inside yourself. So the feelings that come from losing somebody or from losing something, because grief is not only related to death either. Mourning has to do with how you express it. So let's say somebody decides to wear black for a while to honor somebody who passed. That's a way of mourning the person. But grief has to do with the feelings. Is what really hurts, what really comes from inside. And yes, everyone grieves. Not only everyone grieves, I would go one step further and say that every sentient being grieves. Animals grieve, right? They grieve. There are many studies on whales, dolphins, elephants, some birds. They actually have ways of mourning. They have rituals. Like some species of whales and dolphins, they will actually have ceremonies, burials for their members who die. They will push them all the way down to a beach together as a group. Elephants are known for traveling hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles to go back to the place where one of them is laid. And they mourn the bones. Every year they go back. So it's something that has to do with our spirit, right? It's one way that we learn. So, and you can see that because not only humans do it, right? Animals do it. And it's interesting. I just thought of something. As I was in Brazil, my parents live on a farm. And my mother had sowed a batch of cattle, right? Well, most of them had already been separated from their mothers. But there was one. There was still with the mom. And that one was also sowed with the batch. That cow, for 2 days, 2 full days, she stood by the fence looking on the road where the truck left with her baby, crying, in pain. I was in bed sleeping and I could hear her calling him for 2 full days. So it's something that comes from deep inside, something that you can't really control all that well, right? You have to give way to it. You have to allow it to flow, to come out of you, so that slowly you can find healing. What about spirits? Do spirits grieve? Yes. Yes, they do, right? Because they also share the same experience that we shared. We shared together. So when they leave, they're leaving us behind, right? And we are saying goodbye. So it is also painful to them in a way that it also brings sadness to them because they also know that the memories that they share, they're not going to be made again, right? They know that we're going to suffer. And it's even harder if we don't have any religious beliefs, right? If we don't believe in God. Or in our case, we tend to cope it better when speaking of spiritists because we also believe in reincarnation, right? But there are people who don't believe in reincarnation. They believe that this is the one life that you have to live. And depending how you lived it, right, you go to one place or another. But there are other people who don't believe in any of that. They believe that this is it. There is nothing else after here. So it's even harder for them. But spirits also grieve, right? At least for a long time. As we start to evolve as a spirit, as you start to go from one class of a spirit to another, you learn how to deal with that pain better. And grief is really more related to the material rather than to the spiritual, right? So when the spirit gets to a point where they do not need to reincarnate anymore, they no longer grieve, right? Because they understand it different. That is no longer part of them. But they are still able to console us. And in regards to spirits grieving, I read a book. Not sure if they have it in English. It's called Letters from a Dead Woman. It was dictated by Maria João Chico Xavier's mother, which he was one of the biggest mediums to have ever existed. He wrote over 400 books. Spiritism really settled in Brazil through him. And in that book, Letters of a Dead Woman, she talks about her death. And she talks about how difficult it was for her to leave the people that she loved behind, and how hard it was for her to leave her kids that were still small, that she knew needed her, and her husband with all the kids that they had together to raise. So she suffered a lot with her death. But as you start reading the book, she starts to elaborate a little bit more, and she goes, I know now that at the time of my death, even though I wasn't aware of it, there were many other spirits around me, supporting me and helping me go through that. But because of who I was at the time, I wasn't able to perceive them. But now I know that there was divine providence as I was leaving my body. And once I got to the other side, she continues, she says, I felt a soft touch on my back. And when I looked back, the spirit who had been my mother was there waiting for me. And that's how I got through my grief. So not only us, the ones who stay behind, but also the spirit who departs is also going through grief. So we all do it, right? It's part of growing, right? It's part of developing as a spirit. There are several ways that we learn as we are going from life to life. We learn through love, through pain, or through suffering, right? So pain is a big part of who we are. Pain is a big part of how we evolve and how we develop. And grief gives us exactly that. It's probably one of the hardest pains there is, right? So is the loss of those who are dear to us a legitimate source of sorrow, as this is both irreparable and independent of our will? So, is our suffering real, right? Is it justified? This cause of sorrow, from which neither the rich nor the poor are safe, is either a trial or atonement. So it's in the Spirit's book, question 934. So we all go through it. There is no escaping it. It doesn't matter if you are the best person on this planet or the worst. We will all go through this pain in this life, and we have gone through this pain in past lives, and we will go through it again in future lives, right? So we have to learn how to cope with this, how to manifest our sorrows and our pains and our grief. Now, is there a right and wrong way to grieve? And what should you say to a grieving person? What do you think? Is there a right and wrong way to grieve? Not necessarily, right? And there is no saying how long it's going to last. So you can grieve for a couple of weeks, a couple of months. There are people who grieve for decades, who never actually stop grieving, right? But there is something that we have to be able to observe, right? Because if we are not able to express our feelings, if we shut it inside of us, if we don't allow it to express itself, there are dangers that could come from it, right? So scientists and therapists, they usually say that 6 months is about how long people usually take to go through grief. Anything longer than that could be harmful, right? It could start bringing you problems. And what are some of the byproducts of grief that you have to be aware of, to not to allow yourself to get into them? Depression is one, right? So anger could be one, right? You get angry at everything. You start to blame everybody or everyone for all kinds of things. Depression, right, is another one. And depression can get so bad that sometimes you just don't feel like doing anything, right? You are incapable of doing anything. And it can get so bad that it can lead somebody to suicide, right? And most times, if you're the one going through a grief so hard and so difficult, you're really not able to see those things. You're really not able to see those signs, right? And that's where families and friends come into place. Because sometimes we are able to see a friend or a loved one that is going through a grief that is so intense that now they're becoming sick. But that person themselves, they can't really see that, right? That's why it's very important for us to learn and to know how to deal with that so we can also help them, right? And many times they are going to need professional help. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? You're not weak because you're grieving so much that you need somebody else, you need a professional to help you. That's what they're there. That's why family is there. That's why friends are there to help us in times of need, right? So we shouldn't see ourselves as weak or dependable or a burden. It's the other way. We have to feel thankful. We have to fill ourselves with gratitude because we have somebody that cares and loves for us that much, right? That they can help us through this. Now, what should you say to a grieving person? What can you say to somebody who's grieving?
How can I help?
How can I help you? Any other ideas?
I'm here for you.
I'm here for you. Well, there is no one answer fits all when it comes to this, right? Because there's so much involved in how you're going to approach that and how you're going to have that conversation, right? The way that you talk to somebody about grief, somebody who believes in God, somebody who doesn't believe in God, somebody who believes that life goes on, somebody who doesn't believe in that. So you really have to know the person, right? In order to be able to better help them. Now, you have to also be very perceptive of how you say, right? You can't come to somebody, to a mother or a father who have lost their kid and say, your kid hasn't died, right? They haven't died. He or she hasn't died. You don't need to suffer this much. You don't need to cry this much. Are you really helping that person if you say this? You're really not. Why? Because in a way or another, you are invalidating the person's feelings, right? You are somehow telling them, you have no reason to cry. Your kid is alive. Well, you're not really grieving the spirit, right? You're grieving the person, the who, not the what. So it's not the spirit that you're grieving. You're grieving who that child was, who that person was, right? So the best thing you can do is to say, I am so sorry you're going through this pain. There's really nothing, right? I can do to take that pain from you. But I want you to know that I am here if you need me, right? If you want, I can just sit here and not say a word. I can hold your hand. If you want, you can talk to me about your feelings, right? We can have a conversation. But it's very important that you know that even though I can't take this pain from you, even though I can't take this sorrow and this suffering from you, you don't have to walk this path alone, right? I'm here, which is what you said, right? I am here for you in times of grieving. Many times, all we want is somebody to be there, right? To know that if you need, you have somebody who can be there for you. And this is all you can do. But you can't take that pain away. You can't make it disappear. You can't share in that pain. You just can't, right? Grief is our and ours alone. We have to carry it. We have to express it so we can heal from it, right? But our friends and family, we can make ourselves present and available to those people, to whomever need it. So blessed are they who weep, for they shall be comforted. So Jesus said this, right, in Matthew 5:4. What do you think he meant when he said this? Blessed are they who weep. Is he wishing pain unto us? No, right? It has nothing to do with that, right? When you cry, when you weep, you feel, right? When you feel, you are closely connected to God, right? Have you noticed that? When are you closest to God? Is it in the happiest moments of your life? Sometimes we're so happy that we forget about God, right? But when we are immersed in pain, when we are immersed in sorrow, what is the first thing that comes to our mind? Who do we claim for? God, right? God, help me, right? So this is so blessed are those who suffer, blessed are those who cry, who feel pain, right? Because they are connected to God, right? We are able to express ourselves. So you who understand the spirit life, listen to the beating of your heart, calling to those loved ones. And if you would ask God to bless them, you would feel within you those powerful consolations that dry tears, those marvelous aspirations that show you the future promised by the sovereign Lord. So when you first read this, you don't quite really understand what it means. But when you start to pay attention, right? If you listen to your beating heart, and if you ask God to help those who have left, who have departed, right? You will feel those consolations. So it's talking about prayer, right? So when we are going through grief, when we pray for those who have left, we are also benefiting ourselves, right? We are also helping ourselves, which is something that we can never forget. When we are immersed in pain and suffering, one of the best things we can do is talk to God. It's pray, right? It's elevate our spirits, our hearts, and our souls, and ask for providence, ask for consolation, and we will always have it. Now, what does Spiritism do for those who grieve? Brings hope, consolation, knowledge, right? It helps us to better deal with our feelings. We understand that it's part of who we are, right? We're able to look at things with gratitude and love and thankfulness rather than just look at things as punishment or pain or suffering, right? When somebody that we love, that is dear to us, does incarnate, many times we give into despair, right? But we forget that we have so much to be thankful for. We're thankful for the memories that we shared together. We're thankful because they were part of our life and we were part of their lives, right? We are thankful for the love they gave us and for the love that we are able to give them. And when you can no longer give them that love, you can still use that love to build something good, right? To build something great. How many charities are born from loss, right? From the loss of a friend, from the loss of a child. And the person who stays grabs that love and that passion that they had for that family, and they create foundations, right? Charities. And they spread that love, and they are able to channel that into something good, right? How many kids are loved by parents who have lost their kids, right? They're able to get that love and give it to a child that doesn't have any parents. So we can change the pain and we can change the suffering into something good, right? Rather than being so hurt and immersed in sorrow, we can slowly start to change that into gratitude, into thankfulness, right? Into remembrance, to a point where you no longer have that person physically here. But if you really listen, you can feel the spirit, right? And you are able to rejoice in the memories and in the life that you had together. So Spiritism softens the bitterness of life's sorrows, and it calms the soul's desperation and agitation. I hope you guys enjoyed the talk tonight. It's been a pleasure being here. And if you have any questions, if you want to talk about anything else, we'll be outside. And if you or somebody that you know is going through to grief, on Wednesdays here we have our fraternal meetings, right? You can come and talk to us. And the workers will be able to maybe give you some words of consolation, right? They are not psychologists in here, right? It's not therapy. It's coming to talk to a friend and hear words of encouragement and love. God bless you all. It was a pleasure.